let's get on with the discussion of beginning with chapter 12. So Kingsnorth's goal in part 3 of the book is, quote, to examine how the machine manifests in the culture, society, and politics of the age. That's from page 128. And I guess I'll make that larger for now. In chapter 12, Kingsnorth offers a thumbnail sketch of what has happened internally over the past 500 years. In this effort, he contrasts the 4 P's, past, people, place, and prayer, with the 4 S's, science, the self, sex, and the screen, as a conceptual framework for discerning the older values from machine values. Early in the chapter, Kingsnorth makes an argument that I think is worth considering. And this is a quote from the book. Let me see. Yeah. The age, I think, is unique. It might be that everyone thinks this about their time, but I think that today we have a good case. The sheer scale of global culture, the degree of technological interconnectedness, the dangers of those technologies, from AI to nuclear missiles, the human impact on the natural world, and the rapid falling away of many things that have buoyed and sustained us for centuries, from languages to religions, means that the times we live in are perhaps less rooted than any time in history. We may be in the process of creating something unique in human history, a global anti-culture, unmoored from reality and increasingly at war with it. As you may have noticed, Kingsnorth is very tentative in the way he writes. We may be in the process. It might be that everyone thinks that this about their time. And I would love to speak with him off the record to ask, if that was just to be, I guess, more careful, or if he really does kind of have an agnostic position. My gut feeling is that he is not so agnostic and does feel like we do live in a unusually unique time, and I don't really see how one could look objectively and interpret things otherwise. One doesn't want to be like Chicken Little and scared that the sky is falling, and then nothing's actually happening. But there are certainly many things that are unique to our time, and as I'll get into here a little bit later, the biggest one probably is that the scale is the big difference. While there have been these kind of large empires and so on, and rises and falls of empires in the past, the scale is different, and some other things are different too, which we'll get into here in a second. I want to see if I can make this, scroll this down. Does not look like I can do that. So that's unfortunate. So we'll just go back to me. I guess I have to save each page of the PDF separately. It's actually not a PDF, it's a JPEG. And then put each section up separately. So that's going to take a little bit more work in the future, but hopefully that was helpful for a little bit at least. So I'm going to get back to the blog post. When it comes to orienting oneself in history, many believe that there is nothing new under the sun, and that what we're experiencing is nothing new. This may be true in one regard, but it's not true when it comes to the scale with which the modern world is constructing edifices on precarious foundations. As I've mentioned elsewhere, technology is a lever for creating an outside outcome from the inputted effort. The modern world has the greatest, and thus the most potentially destructive, levers ever seen by humans. Nuclear Nuclear energy is the most obvious example, and AI is one of the latest ones. One of many possible examples that one could point to is that of urbanization. Sorry, one second. One commenter on one of my videos argued that modern urbanization is nothing new because, quote, there have always been cities. The reality, of course, is far more nuanced. There has been no more urbanized culture than that of our modern world. Over half the world population currently lives in cities, and this number is only increasing. Historically, empires would rise and fall, but by far the greatest part of their population, over 90%, was rural and made their living from the land. When these great empires collapsed in history, they could eventually be rebuilt because the strength of humanity lay in the diffuseness of populations, as well as in the close relationship with the land, which provided sustenance regardless of the fortunes of any particular empire. As Kingsnorth noted earlier in the book, once a megacity is created, it is forced to colonize and deplete the surrounding world of its natural resources. Otherwise, it and its inhabitants will die. Modern megacities are a wholly new phenomenon. It's believed that the largest pre-modern cities peaked at around 1 million inhabitants, which is not small, but certainly not the tens of millions we see today. Also, large pre-modern cities were exceedingly rare, whereas in the modern world, they have become the rule rather than the exception. It's simply not helpful to downplay the truly legitimate concerns that Kingsnorth and those before him has raised. It's an interesting thing. It shuts down a conversation when one tries to point out the very obvious differences that the modern world has, the outside kind of levers, the scale with which our technology has infiltrated our lives, especially if you look at the smartphone. Where in history was there anything that resembled the smartphone and the kind of really evil effects that it is having on generations of children? It doesn't exist. The modern world is something that's different, and people will just kind of try to shut down a conversation by saying, well, you're just you're overreacting, and every age thinks that they're special or something. So it's it's not helpful to, I mean, essentially it's kind of like sticking one's head in the sand, and I think there's probably a lot of that that's going on, and I'm sure I do it too. So I don't want to pretend like I like the news that the modern world is unique in bad ways, but I probably have found a way to live with it better maybe than some other people. So, but I do sympathize. As I say later on, no one wants to, including myself, we all want to stay in the matrix. Here's another quote from Kingsnorth from page 128. It, that is modern culture, is an anti-culture, because the elements of human life from which cultures of all kinds, however different, have traditionally sprung, are negated by today's way of life. The values of the machine are an attack on the values upon which pre-modern traditional societies were built. The new values are predicated on the pursuit of liberation, a one-word descriptor of the essence of the Western program since 1789. So that is the French Revolution. Our aim, stated or unstated, is to liberate ourselves from nature in all regards, so that we may conquer the stars, conquer death, and become as gods, knowing good and evil. End quote. Kingsnorth raises another important issue that is usually underappreciated because it's completely missed. Modern culture is actually an anti-culture. which is a hard pill to swallow because we were all born and raised in this anti-culture, and so we experience it as comfort food. Humans by nature will create culture wherever they are. The anti-culture that modernity has created, however, is a counterfeit version of the real thing. I won't get too lost in the weeds here. The consideration of what constitutes true culture would require much more space and is something that we will need to return to. But it's worth pointing out that there is a difference between the anti-culture that the modern world produces and true culture that is created in a certain time and a certain place by a certain people and in a way that reflects, stabilizes, and instructs these people in their community as to how to live beautiful and meaningful lives. So yeah, it's definitely a topic that I'd like to return to because it's very hard to see. There's an overlap of kind of ancient culture and the culture that we have created in the modern world. The thing that's one of the many things that is unique about the anti-culture that we've created is that, except for language, if you heard much of it, you wouldn't know where it originated. If you go back 50 years, you'd hear, well, that was something. If you heard the Beatles, you could tell that it was maybe English, and then if you heard the Beach Boys or something, you say, oh, well, that's clearly California American music. But increasingly, as our cultures intersect with those of the rest of the world, we increasingly have a single monoculture, which does not represent local realities and does not do the things that culture does, which is to unite and to give meaning to one's day-to-day existence. And anyway, there's a lot to unpack there, and eventually we will get to it. So I'm checking out the text messages. We who have experienced both times are confused because our paths are so different from our childhood peers. Yes, well, that's one of the things Kingsnorth mentions is those of us who have seen the passage of time have noticed that the machine makes sure, if you live in the modern West especially, that the world that you grew up in no longer exists. And so we can see the change that has happened. Younger people cannot, because they did not see, obviously, the previous version. They might see it in films and stuff, but it's disorienting for sure. I have the blog you sent and I'm reading along. Very good. Hello, Audrey. Glad you're here. I think a lot of people have noticed this anti-culture, but maybe don't have the language to express what they're noticing. Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's one of the things I want to do here increasingly, is to provide kind of clarity about those kind of questions. What is a culture? And in what way is the modern anti-culture not a culture? So after the Kingsnorth book study, we'll go back to our consideration of machine versus human values, and then eventually we'll get to the question of culture as well. Maybe non-culture is a better description. It might be. That'll become clear, probably more clear. I guess that the idea of the anti-culture is that it's actually destructive of real culture. So it is a non-culture, and yet it's kind of like the difference between a non-Christ maybe and an anti-Christ. So it's not just not a culture, it's also like a destructive force, which pretends that it is the real thing. The current socioeconomic pressure flattens out all the differences. Yes, yes. Well, and this is one of the huge things that people kind of forget. It's because it's just the reality that we experience, which is that our economic, our financial safety net is based around our careers. We have lost any sense of a community safety net, and the best thing we could do for ourselves is to build community safety nets. Even when we don't need to use them, just having them, just knowing that there's another person who lives next door or close by, who has some kind of skin in the game when it comes to my life. The modern world is set up in such a way where we're all expected to have our act together, which is not a bad thing. One should have one's act together, but things happen, obviously. And so we get a lot of people on the margins. And sometimes there's someone to pick up the pieces, to fill in the gaps, but often there's not. Probably more often than not, there's not. And it's often because for people that have, maybe not come from whole families or have been orphaned, and our culture is not set up to provide for that. So we have the state, which does not a great job of filling in the gaps. So yeah, the socioeconomic pressure flattens out all the differences because one doesn't have the luxury of addressing kind of this deeper issue, which is why the only way to address it is to begin to live in a different way and to become less dependent on the grid and the system, and to build stronger communities. So in chapter 13, Kingsnorth discusses the roots and consequences of our culture of inversion, where all that was once held sacred has been largely undermined. Here's a quote. America, said American poet and essayist Robert Bly, was, quote, the first culture in history that has colonized itself, end quote. And then Kingsnorth continues, in The Revolt of the Elites, American historian Christopher Lasch forecast the future accurately. Quote, the culture wars that have convulsed America since the 60s, he wrote, are best understood as a form of class warfare in which an enlightened elite, as it thinks of itself, seeks not so much to impose its values on the majority, a majority perceived as incorrigibly racist, sexist, provincial, and xenophobic, much less to persuade the majority by means of rational public debate, as to create parallel or quote-unquote alternative institutions in which it will no longer be necessary to confront the unenlightened at all. That's from page 144. If Christopher Lasch is correct, and the elites are creating parallel or alternative institutions in which it will no longer be necessary for them to confront the unenlightened at all, end quote, then it should be relatively easy to recognize that most culture war issues, abortion, gender, race, etc., are basically a smokescreen to provide cover for the deeper projects that the elites are at work on. I'm not a fan of conspiratorial thinking. Absent actual facts, it's too easy to conduct witch hunts in the shadows. Conspiracy theories can be dangerous. But in many ways, this conspiracy can be seen in plain sight. The real work of the modern world is decided on by the elites at places like Davos, Switzerland, where every year the World Economic Forum brings together a few thousand of the world's wealthiest people: investors, business leaders, political leaders, economists, celebrities, and journalists, to discuss what? Presumably, to discuss those issues that are of most interest to the world's wealthiest people. And I'm sure that they tell themselves that the ways in which they use their vast amounts of wealth is ultimately in the quote-unquote best interest of everyone else. In the United States, it's easy to see the ways in which these elites, among whom are the CEOs of multinational corporations, lobby for the benefit of their industries, pharmaceutical, medical, agricultural, military, and so on. One only has to ask oneself how much actually changes under a new government administration to see the reality. That while a particular administration might throw their constituents a bone or two, usually regarding a culture war issue that doesn't cost the elites much, if anything at all, those issues of most interest to the elites do not get touched. One example, despite the current administration's apparent interest in ending wars, the military budget only continues to increase. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the culture war issues do not matter. I'm saying that ultimately, one, your vote and your opinion is of very little consequence, which is why, two, you definitely shouldn't allow political differences to divide you from your friends and family. And this is also because regardless of one's politics, ultimately, we are all on the same quote unquote side. That is not the side of the elites. Three, even if your particular candidate appears to win one battle for you, you can be assured that you will eventually lose a future battle. It's necessary that neither side ever gets what it wants, so as to ensure that the culture war continues. Four, you are not aware of or are simply not addressing the real things that affect you most profoundly. The deployment of huge amounts of capital to ensure that you continue to purchase expensive healthcare, medications, technology, advertising, industrial food products to support or at least tolerate forever wars, and so on. For the above reasons, I've found that a good principle is to refuse to engage in conversations about culture war issues, and this includes complaints about politicians. These conversations usually go nowhere. Everyone has their favorite quote-unquote facts, which are of varying worth, at least nowhere good. They perpetuate the culture war, increase division, and distract us from the truly transformative changes that actually affect us. Kingsnorth ends the chapter with a proposal for a path forward. Quote, "The antidote to this is to dig down to those foundations and begin the work of repair. We are going to have to learn to be adults again, to get our feet back on the ground, to rebuild families and communities, to learn again the meaning of worship and commitment, of limits and longing. We are, in short, going to have to grow up. This is long, hard work, intergenerational work. It is myth work. We don't really want to begin, and we don't really know how to. Does any child want to grow up? But there's nothing else for it. No other path is going to get us home." End quote. That's from page 147. In conversations on topics such as these, I often find myself saying that most people don't actually want to escape from the matrix. Most folk are content to continue with the status quo, largely because acting contrary to quote-unquote normal society is too difficult. I sympathize, I know the feeling, and yet there will, of course, come a time, perhaps sooner than we imagine, when we will not have the luxury of continuing our life of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Especially for those who are parents, we need to think long and hard about what kind of world we will leave for our children and what kind of life we want to inspire them to live. It can be difficult to have a vision for what to do because this is intergenerational work, as Kingsnorth says. It's going to take a long time. Just as the cathedrals in Europe were intergenerational projects and gifts to the future, so is the project of rebuilding human-scale cultures. And obviously, they did it in Europe for future generations, and we are the inheritors of their generosity. So it's been done before, and it will have to be done again if we are to hope for something better. Let me go back to let's see. So true. All the state does is throw money at the problem. Yes, yes. And it's, it's what the government does, and it's what we've allowed to happen. We've allowed all this money to be funneled to a huge, powerful governing body thousands of miles away from the communities that need the help. And then it's not really surprising, that the money doesn't get back and doesn't get used well. The world's wealthiest people are using everyone else as slave labor. It's a remarkable thing. I've been listening to Wendell Berry's book, The Unsettling of America. And one of the things he points out, it's something that Kingsnorth points out, and probably not a new idea maybe to either of them, but that this enclosure, this colonization, is an ongoing thing. The European powers came to America, colonized the country. So the indigenous folk suffered, had their way of life destroyed, and then the American farms started to develop. And in time, the farmers, America is being colonized by itself. So the farmers were, there were probably some other folk in between the 16th century and the 20th century. But one other stage was the colonization of the farms by the agricultural industrial complex. And so the farmers got displaced. And now with AI, we see the white collar workers are being displaced. So it's just an ongoing cycle of colonization, and all in the name of efficiency, and regardless of whether it's good or bad for humanity. So actually, I did have one slightly hopeful thought as I listened to Wendell Berry's book. There's would seem to be a place maybe for a return to small scale farming, and perhaps we'll see more of that as the opportunities for white collar work diminish. There could be a kind of a return to the land, which would be a great thing. Not everyone can be consumers. Someone has to create. Indeed. Well, I mean, everyone used to be creators, obviously consumers as well, but we have created a consumer class. Some anthropologists have been using the term post-human era to describe our present time. Yeah. Well, I'd be interested to hear, what they mean exactly by that. It kind of comes back to what it means to be a human, and AI is a horrible creator. We need human ingenuity. Yes. So, as I mentioned, if you have joined recently, there's a link to the blog post that I'm reading, and it's we're on chapter 14 now of Kingsnorth's book. So I'm gonna just read through the last section of the blog. There's a link, like I said, in the show notes to the text. In chapter 14, Kingsnorth looks at leftist politics and culture and makes the convincing argument, obvious once you see it, that leftism and machine culture are one and the same. Quote, Quote, but what if both of them were something else? What if the ideology of the corporate world and the ideology of the progressive left had not forged an inexplicable marriage of convenience, but had grown all along from the same rootstock? What if the left and global capitalism are at base the same thing, engines for destroying customary ways of living and replacing them with the new world of the machine? The very notion of a political left was birthed with modernity. The term comes from the seating arrangement of the anti-monarchy faction of the French Assembly after the Revolution. Despite much self-mythologizing in the ensuing centuries, and despite occasional and sporadic popular support, leftist ideology has remained primarily a product of urban intellectuals and middle-class radicals pursuing a project of theoretical leveling. Looked at this way, it's not hard to see that progressive leftism and the machine, far from being antagonistic, are a usefully snug fit. Both are totalizing utopian projects, both are suspicious of the past, impatient with borders and boundaries, and hostile to religion, superstition, and the limits on the human individual imposed by nature or culture. Both are in pursuit of a global utopia where, in the dreams of both John Lennon and Vladimir Lenin, the world will live as one. Pages 151 to 153. If Kingsnorth is correct, and I think that he is, then we can see another obvious truth about modern democratic government. The quote-unquote right pushes the economic values of the machine, while the quote-unquote left pushes the social values of the machine. Regardless of who is in power, the work of the machine continues apace. Finally, in chapter 15, Kingsnorth discusses the appearance of what the French sociologist Jean Baudrillard referred to as hyper-reality. Quote, a world in which fake things would come to seem more real than reality itself, end quote. Baudrillard conceived of this idea more than 4 decades ago, and with the rise of virtual reality, gaming culture, the AI apocalypse, and so on, it's clear that his prophecy is coming true. There's another quote from the book. Modern humanity's attempt to build its own quote-unquote closed system to replace nature and tradition, said French intellectual René Guénon, could never succeed, but instead would lead to an artificial world, which would result in an artificial mentality among its people. The modern mentality, he wrote, is no more than the product of a vast collective suggestion. The modern mentality, he wrote, is no more than the product of a vast collective suggestion. It's a pretty remarkable sentence. When enough people realized this, he predicted, a reaction would ensue amongst those who wanted to resist the disintegration. So yeah, that sentence essentially is describing the Matrix. But since even, quote, those who most sincerely want to combat the modern spirit are almost all unwittingly affected by it, end quote, the danger would be a kind of false traditionalism, quote unquote, doing battle with an equally false progress, quote unquote, all against the background of a time in which genuine spiritual unity was a distant memory and truth itself was disputed on all sides, which may sound familiar. Kingsnorth adds at the end, tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure. That's from page 165. So in case we needed more encouragement not to get caught up in culture war issues, Guénon's admonition from nearly 100 years ago should help. The world that we know or thought we knew has died, and attempts to resuscitate it are futile. When Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that God is dead, he was not referring to God, but to the death of God within society, within people. Similarly, what we regard as our culture is dead because we no longer live according to the life that gave our culture birth and sustenance. Cultures are living organisms and require humans to embody them. I don't want to end on a negative note, however, so I will leave Kingsnorth with the last and hopefully hopeful word. So it's one last quote from page 156. When people ask me where I stand, and I don't know if he was thinking about Wendell Berry's famous quote It's very pith. He said, Barry wrote somewhere, what I stand on is what I stand for. So I think he was probably thinking of Wendell Berry when he wrote this. When people ask me where I stand, I say these days that it's with an older tradition, the same one I was writing about in that first book, although I didn't know it then. It's a tradition which takes its stand not according to ideological positioning, but according to actual positioning on Earth, under the sky, surrounded by people who know where the sun rises in the morning, where they come from, and who they are. It resists the machine's totalizing force from a perspective rooted in the 4 Ps. People, place, prayer in the past. Neither left nor right nor anywhere else. It's a tradition that crosses all the modern divides because it is older than all of them. It digs down literally to the root of the matter. This is the dream of a localized populist alternative to gigantist, destructive modernity in all its forms. But it's not really a political project, at least not exclusively. Political solutions are for political problems, but the origins of our culture's crisis are much deeper than the surface level on which politics operates. The culture war is not, in my view, about politics at all. It's not even about culture. It is about something else entirely. But what? So that is my those are my thoughts for this week. There was a lot more content this week because I added an extra chapter. I think it's probably going to be all right. Hopefully, we aren't moving too quickly. It's definitely substantially more work to keep up with. Yeah, I would like to finish by mid-January. So we'll continue at this pace. I think 3 or 4 chapters a week. Hopefully, it's in a reasonable amount. So, yes, welcome, Juhan. But what? Well, I mean, I think I haven't gotten to that part of the book. This is on my second reading, and I can't recall. My assumption is, it's a spiritual crisis. That's where Kingsnorth ends up, and that's. I mean, I think ultimately that's the reality. Is that it's not a crisis of politics. It's not a crisis of culture. It's a crisis of spiritual reality and meaning, ultimate meaning. So yeah, which is kind of, I get more into these topics on the Monday evening live stream where I talk about the theological aspects of the book. So although I've gotten a little bit down a rabbit trail looking at capitalism, but hopefully that'll be worth the effort. So I think that's all I have for tonight. I'm glad. Thank you so much for being here as always. I'm going to try to continue on the schedule of Monday and Thursday evenings at 7:30. As I've mentioned recently, the specific dates and times will be in each week's newsletter, both the Protecting Veil and Gadfly Academy newsletters, weekly newsletter. So if you aren't on those lists, I encourage you to sign up for those newsletters.